When America gets upset, it doesn't just speak its mind, it takes to the streets. But how it does so often depends on which side of the political aisle is doing the protesting. It's like the country has two very different ways of showing it's angry. On one side, you have what you could call the flames approach. This is when frustration boils over into direct disruptive action. Protesters block highways, occupy buildings, and sometimes things escalate. Storefronts are smashed, cars are set on fire, and chaos fills the air. It's a loud, confrontational, and often destructive way to demand change. You see it, you hear it, and you definitely can't ignore it. On the other side, there is a quieter, more solemn response. We can call this the candles approach. Instead of clashing with police or breaking windows, this style of protest involves gathering peacefully. People hold candlelight vigils, they organize prayer circles, and they sing hymns. The goal isn't to disrupt the system, but to appeal to a higher moral authority, whether that's God or the nation's conscience. It's a call for calm, reflection, and unity in the face of what they see as a cultural or political wrong. This method is less about forcing change through immediate pressure, and more about showing collective grief or resolve through quiet strength. This divide isn't random. It reveals a deep split in how different groups in America view power, change, and society itself. The left, often feeling marginalized by the system, tends to believe that you have to shake things up to be heard. If the system is the problem, then disrupting that system becomes a valid form of protest. They see it as speaking truth to power in the only language power understands: disruption. Meanwhile, the right often sees the system as fundamentally good, but under threat. Their goal is not to tear it down, but to restore it to what they believe it should be, which is why their protests often take the form of orderly, patriotic, or religious gatherings. Of course, these are not universal rules. Not every liberal protester throws a brick, and not every conservative lights a candle. There are plenty of peaceful marches on the left. And as we saw on January 6, 2021, the right is capable of its own form of political violence. But the general tendencies are clear. The flames of riotous protest have become strongly associated with left-wing responses to injustice, while the candles of prayer vigils are a hallmark of the right's reaction to cultural decay. Understanding this difference is key to understanding the deep fractures in American society today. The left's tradition of disruptive protest has deep historical roots. It comes from a long line of radical activism that sees the status quo as inherently oppressive. Think about the labor strikes in the early 20th century, where workers had to physically stop production to get fair wages. Or consider the civil rights movement, where activists used sit-ins and marches to deliberately break segregation laws and force the country to confront its injustice. Later, Vietnam War protests saw students occupying university buildings and clashing with authorities. This philosophy of direct action, influenced by socialist and anarchist thought, argues that sometimes you have to break things, whether it's a law or a window, to build something better. The right, on the other hand, draws from a different history. Its protest tradition is more connected to religious revivals and civic rituals. Imagine the massive crusades led by evangelist Billy Graham, which brought thousands together for prayer and moral renewal. Or think of the pro-life movement, which has for decades organized peaceful marches and prayer vigils outside of abortion clinics. These events are not about causing chaos. They are about demonstrating moral conviction and appealing to the heart of the nation. The underlying belief is that America is a nation founded on good principles, and the way to fix its problems is through faith, community, and a return to traditional values, not through revolution. These historical patterns continue to shape protests today. When the left sees a problem like systemic racism or economic inequality, its activist wing often defaults to the playbook of disruption. The idea is that the system won't change on its own, so it needs to be forced. This can create a high tolerance for tactics that cross the line from protest into property destruction, as it's sometimes framed as a necessary part of the struggle against an unjust system. The focus is on immediate, visible confrontation to expose the cracks in society and demand urgent action from those in power. In contrast, when the right sees a threat, like what it views as attacks on religious freedom or traditional family structures, its response is often to circle the wagons. The protest takes the form of a community gathering to reaffirm its values. Prayer becomes a political act. A candlelight vigil becomes a statement of defiance against what they see as encroaching darkness. This approach is less about confronting the state and more about strengthening the community from within. It's a way of saying, we will not be moved, and we will keep our faith and our way of life intact, trusting that this quiet resolve will ultimately win the day. The summer of 2020 put the flame style of protest on full display. After the murder of George Floyd, protests against police brutality erupted across the nation. Many of these demonstrations were peaceful, filled with people from all walks of life demanding justice. However, in many cities, these protests spiraled into riots, looting, and arson. From Minneapolis to Portland, the nights were lit by burning buildings and police cars. The damage was immense, totaling billions of dollars. For those involved, the destruction was a visceral expression of rage against a system they felt had failed them for centuries. It was a roar of pain that could not be ignored. Then came January 6, 2021. This event showed that the right is also capable of political violence, but it was different in its own way. After a rally where President Trump claimed the election was stolen, thousands of his supporters marched to the U.S. Capitol and stormed the building. They weren't protesting a long-standing systemic issue in the same way as the George Floyd protesters. Instead, they saw themselves as patriots trying to stop the steal and defend the system from what they believed was a corrupt election. It was a riot, but one framed by its participants as an act of preservation, not revolution. It was a shocking outlier to the right's usual candle approach. While January 6th was a major exception, the right's more typical response is seen in smaller, community-focused events. When conservative values feel under attack, for example after a church is vandalized or a controversial law is passed, the reaction is rarely to riot. Instead, you are far more likely to see a prayer rally, organized on the church steps, or a peaceful gathering at the state capitol. These events are designed to show solidarity and moral resolve. The message is one of endurance and faith. They are turning to God and their community for strength, reinforcing their values in the face of what they perceive as a hostile culture. These modern examples highlight the deep divide. The George Floyd protests, even in their destructive form, were aimed at dismantling what was seen as an oppressive structure. The violence was an outgrowth of a demand for fundamental change. January 6th, while violent, was driven by a desire to overturn a specific outcome to preserve a particular leader's power. It was a defense of their version of the system. This shows that while both sides can resort to extreme measures, their motivations and the stories they tell themselves about their actions are worlds apart, rooted in fundamentally different views of America itself. So why the huge difference? One of the biggest reasons is the philosophical divide between changing a system and preserving it. The left's activist wing often operates from the belief that America's core institutions are systemically flawed and oppressive. To them, politeness and order are tools the powerful use to maintain control. Therefore, disruption isn't just an option, it's a moral duty. If you believe the house is rotten to its foundations, you don't pray for it to get better, you start knocking down walls. This helps explain why property destruction during protests is sometimes excused as a voice of the unheard. The right's candle approach comes from an opposite belief, that America's foundations are good and worth saving. The system, in their view, is not the problem. The problem is the people who are trying to undermine it with progressive ideas. Their protests are therefore aimed at restoration, not revolution. They gather to pray for the nation, to call for a return to constitutional principles, and to show respect for the flag and the law. This is why their events tend to be orderly and patriotic. They are trying to model the kind of society they want to preserve, one based on order, faith, and tradition. Geography also plays a big role. Left-wing protests are often centered in dense, anonymous urban environments where large crowds can gather quickly and a sense of collective anger can escalate into mob behavior. In a big city, it's easier to feel like a small part of a massive, faceless movement. Right-wing gatherings, on the other hand, are frequently based in smaller towns or suburban communities, often centered around a church. These settings naturally encourage a more personal and solemn atmosphere. When you're standing next to your neighbors and pastor, you're less likely to start throwing rocks. Ultimately, these two styles of protest reflect a nation that is no longer speaking the same language. One side sees a country that needs to be radically transformed, even if it means burning parts of it down. The other sees a country that needs to be protected and restored through faith and order. The flames represent a desperate and angry demand for a new future. The candles represent a hopeful and determined plea to save the past. As long as these two visions of America remain so far apart, the way Americans protest will continue to be a story of fire and faith.